I saw a beam of light everywhere. And then the moment I saw those beam of lights, I thought to myself, the rapture is here.
It's like in the corner of her eye, seeing like a little boy or like a little ghost going to one of the rooms.
It's a journey in the self too, because you find your intuition and discernment, but we got to realize that there's duality here.
Maybe 6 or 8 times over the course of a couple of years, I would wake up to this dark figure standing at the foot of my bed.
The lights started like flicking off and on. So it was like a toddler, like a 5-year-old or 4-year-old.
When you see that there's darkness, Satan exists, or that there's evil on earth, or that there's actually demons or whatever. I think it's a frequency we're all together, really.
I was out in the woods as I was normally out, but I was physically frozen. It's where I was hearing these noises, and it sounded like something that was bipedal. And at one point it started to gruff. I heard howls. I heard like this huffing sound, and I was petrified. I had no idea what it was.
Welcome to the show, everybody listening to Apocalyptic Anomalies, where we shine light on the shadows to unlock all the secrets of our universe. I'm your host, Abner J. Valdez. If you have a crazy experience or story you want to share on the show, email me at apocalypticanomalies@gmail.com. That's apocalypticanomalies@gmail.com. Or you can hit me up on Instagram or Facebook. Either way works for me. Just get in contact with me. Today on the show, we have Brian King Sharp, author of Sasquatch Unleash the Truth Behind the Legend and host of Sasquatch Odyssey. He comes on the show and talks to us about his paranormal experiences, UFOs, and possibly Bigfoot. Let's get into the show right now. Sit back and enjoy the show. All right, guys, welcome to Apocalyptic Anomalies. Today on the show, we have Brian from Sasquatch Odyssey podcast and the author of Sasquatch Unleash the Truth Behind the Legend. Brian, can you please tell the audience where they could find you and your work?
Yeah, the easiest place would be to go to our website, paranormalworldproductions.com. You can get everything there. You can buy the book there. You can see all the shows. We have about 7 shows total on our network. I host 4 of those full-time myself, and we have other podcasters that do shows for us. The best place is there, and then anywhere you listen to podcasts, you can get any of the shows. So
that's great.
Wherever they're listening to you right now, they can find me.
That's great, man. Great. So I wanted to just start with an easy question. I read in the book that you were in law enforcement. How long were you in law enforcement, and did you experience anything supernatural during your career in law enforcement?
A total of 16 years in law enforcement, and people have asked me that in the past. I know some police officers. I just literally posted a show today on one of our podcasts, Backwoods Horror Stories, where I read stories about people's encounters that don't necessarily want to come on and do an interview. And I've done a 2-part series about law enforcement officers who experience encounters with mostly Bigfoot, right?
Yeah.
So people ask me that. I was a City of Atlanta cop, so it was very urban. There wasn't a whole lot of Bigfoot in the middle of Atlanta. So I know other officers have had those kind of situations in the past. I've talked about other shows have done stories about officers having encounters with Bigfoot and Dogman and even ghosts in some situations. But no, I didn't have any as a police officer. I had some pretty supernatural experiences with people, but it was all people related. So nothing cryptid related or anything supernatural now.
Cool. Well, I want to jump right into your experience. If you could please share your experience that you had, because I read a little bit about it in your book. I got up to chapter 5, so I still got to finish the book. But yeah, I read a little bit about your experience in the book. If you could please share with the audience in detail your experience with the audience and with me as well.
Yeah, I think a little bit of backstory that I don't really get into in the book is some of the weird things that were happening in that house we were living in, because there was some supernatural things going on there. And I say that because I think it's important to lay that baseline, because I've been asked on other shows. I was a guest on a podcast a couple of years ago, and somebody asked me, do you think it was something other than Bigfoot that you might have experienced in the woods? So I'd like to start there and sort of lay the foundation. We moved into this house, and we were in a really small town. And when I say small town, I don't even think the town had a caution light. It was that small. I think it was like a 4-way stop. And everybody knew everybody. So before we moved into this house, the gentleman who owned it, we were renting it from him. His 2 sons had lived there before us. And there was a lot of rumors about some of the things that they were into. They were supposedly into devil worship, demonic activity, and those kind of things. And when we moved into the house initially, the first thing I did was go outside. I'd never had any kind of land to roam on, and this house had tons of property around it. So we didn't own it, but we had access to it because we rented this place from this gentleman. So I stayed out in the woods, and there was this really cool creek area that I would go to with a bunch of rock and water running through the rocks. It's kind of hard to explain. It wasn't like creek rock. It was solid rock foundations and formations that this water was running to. I thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen as a 11 or 12-year-old.
Yeah.
But there were some weird things that I found in and around the water. There was things that looked out of place. They looked like they were man-made bowls and weird spoons and other things. And I found some things that looked like they were possibly, I don't know, made out of cow skulls and things like that, that as a kid, I thought there were cows in that area, so I thought maybe it just naturally died there. But in retrospect, knowing what I know now, it was probably something that a person had placed there. And I found that a little peculiar, but I'm, like I said, 11 and 12 years old. You don't really think about those things. So the real things that started happening inside the house were what really let me know that something was going on. I started hearing voices in the house. I would have this weird feeling that I was being watched when I was in the house. I would hear scratching, and I was waking up a lot of times. I say a lot of times, I mean, maybe 6 or 8 times over the course of a couple of years. I would wake up to this dark figure standing at the foot of my bed, to the point where I wouldn't stay in my own room. Most often I would get up, I would take a blanket, and I would end up sleeping at the foot of my mom and dad's bed or somewhere on the floor in their room, because I was petrified to stay in my own room. I would shower, and I would keep my eyes open while I was washing my face. It was that kind of scared. I always felt like there was a presence there. So that's what really started in the house. And then I had this experience. I fancied myself as a little bit of a hunter. So I would go out and squirrel hunt and rabbit hunt. And I was out in the woods as I was normally out. And I went into this area that I'd never been in one particular day. And I had this feeling, I just sort of ran into it. And if you get into Bigfoot encounters, like I've documented hundreds of Bigfoot encounters at this point on my show, you'll have people have experiences where they feel like they've hit a wall. They're walking along, everything's going okay, and then they just feel like they can't go any further. That's kind of what happened to me. I felt like I hit an invisible wall, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up, the hair on my arm stood up, and I just had this feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there, and that I needed to be somewhere else. I needed to be getting out of the area. But I was physically frozen. And I think I describe it in the book as I felt like my legs became wooden stakes that were driven into the ground. I literally could not move. And I heard this, it was probably 10, 12 feet away from me, but this was in North Georgia. If you've been in the Carolinas or anywhere in the Southeast, I live in North Carolina now, but in Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, South Carolina, North Carolina, in the summertime, you can go out into the woods, and this place was thick with vegetation. And just on the outskirts of my field of vision is where I was hearing these noises. And it sounded like something that was bipedal. It was walking on 2 legs. It sounded huge. And I could hear it walking just outside of where I could see it. And at one point it started to gruff. I heard gruffs. I heard like this huffing sound, and I was petrified. I had no idea what it was. I knew what it wasn't, though. I knew enough about the woods to know it wasn't a deer. I knew it wasn't a bear. We didn't have bear in that area. And then I heard what sounded like a bluff charge. Now, I didn't know what a bluff charge was back then, but I've studied primates and looked into gorillas and other things. If you've ever seen videos of like a silverback gorilla bluff charging people when they come into their area, that's what it sounded like in the woods, about 10 or 12 feet away from me. And it would stop just on the outskirts of where I could see past this vegetation. This happened a couple of times. It seemed like it lasted forever. It was probably literally 30 or 45 seconds. Might have been a minute, maybe 2 minutes. And then all of a sudden, fight or flight kicked in, and I switched from complete stuck in the ground, couldn't move, to flight. And something clicked in my brain and said, you got to get the hell out of here. And I was able to move my feet. I turned around. I ran. I was completely, as fast as I could, flat out run through the woods, probably 600-800 yards, however far away I was from the house. I dove over the fence and landed into what I thought was a safe zone in the front yard of the house. And it took me a long time to go back in the woods after that, man. I was really concerned with what I had encountered. Never saw what it was. Still to this day, can't say what it was. I had no idea, but it was something I'd never experienced before, and I haven't experienced anything like that since. I've had a couple of experiences since then that put me in a certain place that was close to that, but nothing that close, and those kind of experiences that scared me the way that scared me. And I said that I sort of laid the foundation for that before I got into that story, because fast forward to a couple of years ago, I was a guest on the podcast, and the guy was into this demonic stuff. He was sort of into the, I don't know, I don't even remember what the title he used. The occult. Yeah, it's kind of that kind of thing. And he asked me, he said, have you ever considered that what you experienced in the woods might not have been Sasquatch or Bigfoot? It might have been something that followed you from the house into the woods. Maybe it was whatever entity you were dealing with inside the house that maybe, because that seems to be a common thing, according to him, in some situations where people think they're experiencing. And I have talked to people in the past that claim to have been experiencing what they believe to be Bigfoot, that I believed that they were dealing with some sort of an entity outside of Bigfoot, because they never saw a creature, but some of the things they were describing sounded very similar to what I was dealing with in the house in that experience. So I don't know, man. It was just one of those things where I grew up with stories in that area of people talking about, my great grandparents were talking about Bigfoot. I heard stories about ginseng hunters that were encountering Bigfoot at the time. I even talk about in the very early chapters of the book, I include one of the stories that I heard my grandparents talk about. I discovered it just a couple of years ago when I was doing some research for the podcast. I was wanting to read some stories, and I looked in that area on a database that I have access to, and there was a story from like 1977 that was just a few miles away from my house, from where some ginseng hunters came into contact with what I believe now to be Bigfoot. So I've always correlated that experience to a possible Bigfoot experience. Again, I've never said it was, I never will say, because I didn't see it, but I don't know. I've since that conversation a couple of years ago, I've scratched my head and thought that maybe it was something other than Bigfoot, but I don't know. I definitely experienced something. I just can't explain what it was.
Yeah, that's incredible. That experience definitely changes you for sure. You know, wow, that's amazing, man. What can you say? How long did it take you to go back into the woods where you felt like, okay, I feel like I could go back into the woods and kind of roam around without feeling like a threat or something? How long did that take you before you felt at ease about that or better about it?
It was months and months before I was able to even venture back into the safe places that I had been before. The creek area that I was doing the hanging out in, there was a big pine thicket that I would play in, and I had like a fort, and I'd climbed the trees there, and it was literally, you could see it from the house. So that's where I ventured to first. But it took me a long time to get back into the woods deeper than just a cursory trip to the creek or into this area that was visible from the middle of this pasture outside of the front of the house. So, and I don't know that I ever felt comfortable while we were living there. We were only there for another 2 or 3 years, but I don't know that I was ever comfortable in the woods there after that. And I never had any other experiences that were anything close to that, or anything that even made me think that I was experiencing the same thing. But it was difficult for me to ever be comfortable going any deeper than just the cursory going to the creek kind of thing. But I've talked to so many people at this point that experience that, grown men who hunt. There's tons of people that I've talked to that have had experiences with what they believe to be Sasquatch, or know to be. If you ask them, they know it is because they saw something, that don't go back in the woods after that.
Yeah.
And these are hunters, seasoned hunters with high-powered rifles, and they just refuse to go back and go into these areas because they are so afraid that they're going to run into one of these creatures.
Yeah, and I believe in the book you described it. You were carrying a BB gun or air rifle gun or something like that. So, I mean, if you encountered anything, that's not gonna do much, you know. So,
maybe other than a bird or a small squirrel, I was screwed.
Yeah, so I could definitely see, you know, as 11, 12 years old, you being scared, and anybody would have been scared. Like you said, grown men go into the woods and they encounter these things for sure, and it's a very scary experience. I'm just glad that you were brave enough to not let that, you know, kind of not let you go back into those woods after that, because a lot of people don't go back after they encounter stuff like that. It gets to the point where it traumatizes them in a way, and they just can't find the courage to go back. So I'm glad you're back out there. That's great, man. You know, just rewinding a little bit, right? When you were talking about the dark figure in your room, how often would that happen, or was that just like a one-time deal when you saw that figure?
Yeah, I'd say over the course of maybe 2 to 3 years in that house, it probably happened 5 times that I recall. And I've talked to people that I've tried to find answers about that, because I'm a very Occam's razor kind of guy. My cop brain always goes to
detective.
It's something other than the supernatural, right?
Mm-hmm.
I try to find something that would make a reasonable person go, yeah, this is probably what happened. I don't automatically jump to, oh, it was a ghost, or oh, it was Bigfoot. I'm not that guy. So even in retrospect, looking back at that situation, I've always tried to say, well, maybe it was sleep paralysis. So I've talked to people about sleep paralysis. I'm friends with a couple of clinical psychologists, and I've had conversations with them about it. And they say, no, you know, it doesn't sound like sleep paralysis that you were experiencing. It sounds like something different. So, you know, people say that it was sleep paralysis because it was similar to that, because I would wake up and I would be completely frozen. I couldn't move. But I was awake. I could feel the sensations. I always sleep with a fan on. To this day, I still sleep with a fan on, whether it's 30 degrees outside or whether it's 112. I don't care. It's a noise thing for me. It's a comforting thing. And I remember feeling the fan on my face and hearing the sound when this thing was standing over my bed. And I've even had people ask me, was it the shape of a Sasquatch? Could it have possibly been a Sasquatch? No. It was definitely more of like you would see in a horror movie today, not necessarily like the Thin Man or something like that, but just the outline of what looks like a head and shoulders, and then it just kind of fades into darkness. And I've described it in the past, and this is the only way I can really describe it that would maybe make sense to people, is it's dark in my room, right? But it's darker than the dark. And I don't even know if that makes sense.
A lot of people say that. When they see things like that, it's darker than the black in the room. It's pitch black. It's darker. Wow, go into that, man. Like, because I've never experienced anything like that. That's why I'm very curious about that. You know, I've heard stories. So blacker than black. Wow, it's like, how can you describe that? You know, like, just
it's so difficult, because when I get asked to talk about this experience, which is rare because it's normally all about Bigfoot with me. But that's the only way I've been able to describe it, is being in a dark room and then there being something. It's almost like shades of black. I mean, if you're wearing a black shirt, you're wearing a black shirt now, but you could possibly have another piece of clothing on that might be even darker than that. Maybe a dark stone against the black shirt, or it's just a slight, maybe the shirt is a little bit grayer than black and then something else is blacker. It's kind of that feeling or that sensation, or that's what I saw, that's standing at the foot of the bed. And of course, you know, even as we live out in the middle of nowhere, we're on 40 acres here in North Carolina, and there's no light pollution at all. So if there's not a lot of moonlight going on, it is really dark when it's dark here. But you can see if something's black, right? We have black things like black planters and things outside. You can kind of see it then when you walk outside. It's really dark. You don't have any light. And then there's this black planter that I know we have a tree planted in or something.
Mm-hmm.
So you can kind of see that. It's almost that sort of thing. Like it's blacker than the night, but I don't know. It's really hard to explain, especially when this thing's standing at the foot of your bed and you don't have any idea what it is. I know it's not a planter with a tree in it, right? So
For sure,
I'm trying
man.
to figure out in my 12-year-old brain what's standing at my bed, because nobody's supposed to be here but me. And then again, you know, I've talked about it before. I don't want to sound crazy, but I was
not
hearing
at all,
voices.
man. Not at all.
I was hearing voices at the same time. And people have asked me, I can't tell you what the voices were saying. It was more of, this wasn't all the time, but when I would hear these things, it would be at night typically. And sometimes I've even heard it in the day in this house, but it was mostly at night. But it was always that we really couldn't make out what was being said, but you know, somebody's or something's talking. And then I would hear scratches on the wall that sounded like they were inside the wall behind my bed. Like my bed, the back of the bed where I would lay, and the headrest would be up against the wall. And the wall was an external wall. There was nothing behind my bedroom. Like the window faced out to the outside. I was on the end of the house, so there's not another room. My parents' room was across the hall, and the room directly next to my bedroom was the bathroom that was between my parents. It was only a 2-bedroom house. It was a really small house. And of course, again, you know, my mind goes to, could it have been a squirrel scratching on the wall? Could it have been an animal scratching on the wall, or whatever the case may be? Nothing makes sense, man. I can't Occam's razor it away as much as I would like to, other than saying, I think there was some really nefarious things going on. And I didn't know it at the time. I don't have a great relationship with my dad. I haven't talked to my dad in decades, but
Sure.
I did talk to my mom after we moved out of that house years and years later. Even in recent years, we've had conversations about living in that particular house. And my mom confided in me that my dad was having some of the similar experiences that I explained to her years later, that neither one of us really talked about at the time. She knew it at the time because he had confided in her. And I've always said this sort of with a grain of salt. My dad was going through alcohol abuse. He was doing drugs at the time. He was taking pills, downers, those kind of things. So I take it with a grain of salt that he was having these experiences and hearing voices and going through some of the things that I was going through. But it almost corroborates the two, because if I had not been having those experiences myself and it was just him while he was using drugs and alcohol, some would say, okay, he was having some kind of hallucinations, but I was experiencing those things and I wasn't doing drugs and alcohol at 12 years old. So when you both have those experiences, it seems to be that there's a there. I just don't know what it is. And the closest thing I can come to it, like I said, is some of the things that I believe that the people that were living there before us, these two guys that lived there before us that were pretty well known for this stuff, they have had something to do with that before we moved into the house. So I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it almost seems like these entities, these I guess you could say demonic or evil entities, kind of feed off those negative vibes, right? So wherever there's some type of alcohol or drugs, they kind of try to latch onto that. And it almost seemed like they were trying to scare you to feed off your fear, you know? That's what a lot of people talk about, how they try to kind of install fear in you first, just to get a reaction from you to kind of grip you in that fear, you know? And I mean, I can't imagine going through that at 11, 12 years old, you know? It's like, it's very scary, you know? I've heard stories where people try to yell and nothing comes out, you know? And they try to like move and they can't move. It almost grips you, you know? So, man, it's one of those feelings that, like you said, you can't really explain it. It's almost like it's just a feeling, you know? It's a feeling. It's like, it's there. You see it's there. You physically see it, but it's more of a feeling. Like, man, what do I do now? You're kind of scared, you know? You know, and I feel like a lot of people lean towards their faith in those situations and try to like get out of those situations. Wow, that's very, very interesting stuff, you know? Wow.
Yeah, I've talked to people since then. I've talked to the late Paul Eno. Paul Eno just passed away. And I had him on the show last year, and he did a lot of work with Ed and Lorraine Warren. Most people have seen the Conjuring movies and the Annabelle movies and those people. Well, Paul was originally an investigator with the Warrens when they were doing some of these cases. And that's one of the things that I talked to Paul. We didn't talk about it on the show. I talked to him off air about it because I told him about some of the experiences.
Are those based on true? I'm sorry to cut you off. I just want to know if those based on true events, in your opinion?
Yes, some of those are. Yeah, the Conjuring House in particular was somewhat based in truth.
Wow.
That's one of the things that Paul and I discussed on the episode. He kind of separated the wheat from the chaff about what was real and what wasn't. And a lot of the Warren stories, you know, especially Lorraine Warren, she was probably the most famous of the two Warrens. A lot of the things that she was involved in later in her life got blown out of proportion. And some of those things are obviously made for Hollywood, you know, to make them more interesting. But Paul was one of the first investigators to go into some of these places, and he had tons of experiences in the Conjuring House that he talked about on my show.
Yeah. Wow.
And one of the things we talked about off air was I told him about some of the experiences I had early on, and he said, there's something about some of those cases, for example, some of the cases that you see, like, for example, The Exorcist. Everybody, obviously, it was famously played by Linda Blair. It was a female character, but the actual story that's based on, loosely in truth, was a 13-year-old boy. So that's one of the things Paul talked about doing some of the investigations with the Warrens and some of the things he had done throughout his career was this connection with, like you said, the drug and alcohol abuse, the turmoil. My mom and dad weren't getting along great. There was a lot of fights. They had just had my sister who had an unexpected accident, right? And there were so many things that were going on. And you had me, a 12-year-old prepubescent boy. And I don't know what the culmination of all those things, but it seems like the perfect storm for some of these paranormal and poltergeist, even to the point of where things are moving and being done to people, activity happens.
Yeah.
And he was like, look, Brian, there's a lot to that. I know you may not believe it, but it's a possibility that that's what you were expecting or experiencing. Yeah. So I don't know. I've looked at it in retrospect and I chalk it up to, it was an experience and it was a scary experience. And luckily, I've moved on from that. I've lived in a couple of haunted houses after that as an adult, but it was nothing as serious as what I was experiencing there.
Yeah, and unfortunate, a lot of times when you move into a new property and stuff, it's really not disclosed. Like, hey, just a heads up, this house may be haunted. It's like, hey, it's for rent. It's cheap. You want to move in? So nobody's really expecting those things. And then when they do happen, you're kind of just left there like, well, you know, I'm going through these experiences. How can I either seek for help or how can I try to move my family to a safer place mentally? You know, because I feel like a lot of these things try to harm you spiritually, right? They try to doubt you, make you doubt whatever you believe in, and they try to make you fear, you know, and that's how they grip you. Like I said before, it's crazy because as a kid, growing up, I went to a Pentecostal church. And I saw a lot of things where, like, I guess reverends or pastors would pray on people and you would see demons come out of people. Which to me, again, as a kid, right, I'm looking at that like, what's going on? Like, you know, is this a show? Like, you don't understand it, right? And they're talking in languages, like you said, right? Things you can't understand. Words you can't understand, and for some reason the pastor kind of talks back in tongues. And I mean, it's crazy, man. These things come out of people. They start throwing up or they puke in a bag, and you know, you hear things say, no, I'm not leaving. You know, it's like, what is your name? You know, and stuff like that. It's like, those things are real. They really do exist. I feel like I'm a strong believer that we do have a soul and a spirit, and those things try to attack that, you know. So that is definitely interesting, man. That is, I feel like that's real, you know. So that's crazy, man. I wanted to jump into you mentioned in your book there was a man you knew, Elijah. Your dad knew him, and you knew him as a kid. Are there any interesting stories that he might have shared with you guys? I don't know if that's crossing the line. You know, but are there any interesting stories that he might have shared with you guys about anything supernatural he might have experienced, or something like that you could share on the podcast?
No, nothing that I remember. I talk about Elijah briefly in the book because he was my dad's best friend, and I remember him from early on. I'm talking like 7, 8 years old. These guys would go fishing, and I would tag along with them. But I remember him talking about Bigfoot. He called it a different name from his tribal name, but he talked about experiences that his family and their family had passed on through the generations, but nothing that he had experienced himself. Not to say that he didn't have those experiences, but he didn't share any of those that I recall with us.
Yeah.
And that's, I think that's a common thing. I've talked to a lot of Native American people and First Nations people that we'll talk about it now because it's a different time. But even if you talk to them, they'll tell you now that there are people that are older than them and different generations who still will not talk about the hairy man or Bigfoot or Sasquatch, or even some of the other things that they might experience that would be considered supernatural or some sort of high strangeness. And Elijah wasn't a big talker in the first place, as I remember. He's passed on now, rest his soul. But
rest in peace. Yeah.
He wasn't one of those big talkers, but I do remember him talking a little bit about Bigfoot, and that was it, unfortunately.
Do you feel like a lot of these entities that try to, I guess, attack us, right? Do you feel like that can also be like a hereditary thing? Like it's passed on from generation to generation, like a curse almost? What's your opinion on that?
It's so interesting that you say that, because I've always approached everything I've done, whether it's UFOs, I've had UFO experiences. Obviously, I've lived in haunted houses.
I have to get into those later.
I've had experiences with what I believe to be some sort of entity from the other side. And when I got into documenting people's Bigfoot experiences, I would talk to people over and over and over, and they would tell me, I've had Bigfoot experiences. And I would say things like, well, have you had other weird experiences or anything else? Yeah, there was these strange lights, or I saw this, what looked like an alien craft. And I would always put that in a box. I would check a box over here and go, okay, well, they're having Bigfoot experiences, but they're also having this other weird stuff, but that can't be related. Bigfoot's not an alien. Bigfoot, to me, is a flesh and blood creature that's probably some sort of relict hominoid. And I would check these boxes. And I had a guy on the show, God, it was probably 2 years ago, named Preston Dennett. Preston is huge in the Bigfoot community. He's huge in the UFO, particularly in the UFO community. He's interviewed hundreds or probably thousands of people at this point who have been abductees. He's probably written, at this point, 10 books on the subject. And the first time I interviewed Preston, we were having a conversation, and he asked me if I'd ever had any kind of experience with a UFO. I told him about my UFO experience, and Preston says, Brian, everything is connected. Whether you believe it or not, everything is connected. And that just stuck with me. So ever since that conversation, I've had many conversations since with Preston, I've sort of shifted away from just checking boxes and saying, well, you had this weird experience and maybe not here. Because during some of those conversations with people like Paul Eno, with Preston Dennett, and talking to other investigators, it seems that there is something that's possibly hereditary. Now, I don't know necessarily with demonic possession or something to do with the other side, but particularly with UFOs. I have seen a connection there with family members. I've had so many people that I've talked to on the air and off the air that have had in-depth, sometimes even abductee experiences with UFOs. Wow. That when they dial into their family lineage and start looking back as much as they can, because a lot of times their family members won't talk about it.
Sure.
When they do talk about it, you find that mom has had experiences with UFOs, dad's had experiences with UFOs. Then you get into the grandparents, sometimes great grandparents experience something they can't explain. So in that sense, I do believe that there is some sort of connection. Stan Gordon comes to mind. I've had conversations with Stan Gordon. I've had him on the show a couple of times. Very famous UFO investigator. And Stan talked about the same thing. Some of the cases that he would go out on were multi-generational, right? These people had had experiences on their property, and then generations later, other people are experiencing. So that was a long answer to a short question to say, I do believe there is a common thread that runs through that in some capacity. What that thread is, I still haven't figured that out yet, but I do think that it is a possibility that some of that stuff's connected. And when you start saying that, people say, "Oh, you're getting into the woo. Brian's getting into the crazy stuff. Oh, how can somebody be connected to this person?" Well, you just have to look at the evidence. Honestly, It really goes to the evidence. You can't have conversations with people that have real experiences that you believe they've had. And then they say, and then I talked to my mom, and my mom told me she had been abducted when she was a kid. And then I talked to my dad, and my dad told me the same thing. And my mom had this weird thing in her hand that they couldn't figure out. It was an implant. It's a whole ball of wax that gets presented to you. And I've just gotten to the point where I stopped trying to check the boxes and dismiss things and just accept that although I may not understand it, I may not be able to explain it, I do believe that there is a connection there. And some people even say it's generational with Sasquatch. That's a little harder for me to swallow because I think that those are flesh and blood creatures, but I don't know. I'm open to anything. I'd never say never because as soon as you say never, somebody's going to prove you wrong. So I'm always open to it. I love the conversations with people. And I do believe that I'm going to quote Preston Dennett. If you ever hear this, Preston, I'm quoting you, man. Everything is connected in some way.
Yeah, man, that's very well put. I feel like, in my opinion, I think a lot of these things are can be physical and supernatural, kind of like us, right? Like we live in this world, right? It's a material world, it's a physical world. But when we go to sleep, some people even astral project and they travel. So what is that? What does that tell you? It almost feels like going back to what you said about Preston is everything is connected. We're all connected. How do you feel about a lot of these entities or UFOs? And you mentioned Sasquatch that you feel is more physical, but do you think this is a lot of these cryptids are physical and supernatural as well?
I tell you, the one thing that I've always said is this. Bigfoot to me is at this point, I'm about 80-20 on the fact that they are, if they exist at all, they are a physical flesh and blood creature that exists in our dimension, our plane. They just like we do. Yeah. They're just another being, right? But I tell you, the more I've had conversations with people, I have to open my mind to what we call the high strangeness of the woo and Bigfoot. Yeah. There's so many people who have experiences beyond just a flesh and blood experience with these creatures. It's really made me question if I could be wrong. And again, I'm open to the fact that it's a possibility that... Sure, yeah. And here's the other thing, the flip side of that. They could be something more. They could be an interdimensional creature. They could have some connection with extraterrestrials. I don't know. Here's the other thing. They could be a flesh and blood creature that have some sort of extraordinary abilities, like a cuttlefish, for example, or like we know some other creatures like squid and things that are able to change color and change shape and do things that are considered to be in some way supernatural, but now they're just mundane to us because we know, hey, they just do that, right? It's just part of what they do. Like some people describe eye shine, and I'm not talking about eye shine like, oh, you shine a flashlight and they have the ability to reflect the light and you see eye shine from a deer or another animal or dog or whatever. I'm talking about self-illuminating eyes on Sasquatch. That's a pretty common thing that we hear. If you take a bunch of experiences, you're going to have at least probably 2 out of 10, maybe 3 out of 10 say, yeah, this thing had self-illuminating eyes or appeared to be. How do you explain that? What do you do with that, right? So these creatures could be a combination of things. They could be a very physical creature with some things that we don't understand. And then it is a possibility that they could be even more, and they could be a flesh and blood creature while they're here, and they could move between dimensions and could be totally something else. I think as far as other cryptids are concerned, and the big one for me, the other one outside of Bigfoot, I think number 2 on the cryptid scale would probably be Dogman. It's something that's come about over the last decade or so, probably less than a decade. And I have a really hard time wrapping my brain around a 6 to 7 to 8 foot tall, bipedal, half man, half dog creature. Like that's a tough thing to wrap your brain around, right? But people claim they see these. Police officers, I've heard of stories where police officers have not only seen these things, but allegedly shot them, and to no effect, right? That's a really out there thing. I've always said, if Dogman exists, I cannot figure out how it could physically exist like a large bipedal ape. We know that those things have existed in the past. We know about Gigantopithecus. We know about other huge apes that have existed. Orangutans are pretty big comparative to other apes. So we're, silverback gorillas, other things. We know those things could possibly exist. So it's easier to wrap our brain around. There's a big ape walking around in North America, possibly, than a 7 to 8 foot tall, half man, half. We're talking American Werewolf in London stuff here, right? Yeah. From the 80s. It just doesn't make sense to me. So I've always said, I think these people may be having these experiences. And if they are seeing what they believe that they are seeing, it could be something else. Like there could be a possibility these other cryptids maybe exist, but I don't think they're flesh and blood creatures. I think they may be something else. Chupacabra, some of these other wild Wendigo, some of these other out there things that people claim to see. I just don't know how they could physically exist here all the time and not be discovered on some other level and or seen more often than they are.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's interesting that you put that like that, because going back, right, to your experience in the woods, when you experienced that, you said you kind of froze, right? And you heard a grunt or like a growl almost, right? How did that feel for you, right? And did you have any other, your senses open? Like, was it quiet? Because a lot of people explain it when they have these experiences that it gets kind of quiet, the air gets quiet, and they smell something that's not natural. How can you explain it in your words, like your senses? What were you sensing besides the frozenness and the flight or fight sensation?
It's been a few years, but I can tell you this. I don't remember having the sense of the quietness. I mean, people have talked about in stories they've told to me, the crickets stopped, everything stopped, and then this thing appeared. I didn't really have that sense because it could have happened. Right. Honestly, I couldn't tell you. I was completely focused on what was happening, what I was hearing. Just auditory senses is really all I was focusing on because that's all I had at the moment. I didn't smell anything. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. All I could focus on was what I was hearing. So for me, that's all it was. It was just the overwhelming. And I've had this so many times as a police officer. I've been in some pretty hairy situations, no pun intended.
We're going to have to get you on for another podcast for that, my friend.
There you go. I've been in some hairy situations as a cop where I've been shot at. And when the adrenaline kicks in, you get tunnel vision. You get auditory exclusion, right? You're just focused on what you see. You got very little control over your fingers. I mean, all the blood's rushing to the core of your body just to keep you in survival mode. And that's kind of what I experienced when I was 12. I'd never had that experience before, but I've had it tons of times since as an adult in those kind of situations. And I've tried to take that into account when I'm interviewing people, for example, and them talking about some of the experiences that they've had and just seeing if it's a real visceral reaction. I never want to be the person who interrogates anybody who comes on my show. I make it a safe space for anybody who wants to tell their story. And I've had some wild stories. I've had some really wild stories that I've posted on the show. And people go, wow, how could you have that person? I say, well, it's their experience, right?
Exactly.
But I've tried to draw on that feeling and knowledge and actual experience that I've had later in life to go back and even look at my own experience. And again, like I said, I can say I was having everything else just stopped. I was focused on what I could hear. It's kind of the same thing, again, as a police officer. Focus on the suspect who's shooting at me. You get auditory exclusion. You don't hear. That's why, you hear stories of police officers I've heard people have told me, I was screaming at you, dude. You didn't hear me? No, I didn't hear you. I was focused on the threat, right? So it's kind of those things that you physiologically go into. So I've use that sort of to look at some of the experiences people have and talk about some of those things and kind of break it down for them, because a lot of people struggle with what they go through and they don't understand what happens to them physiologically in those situations, whether it be the stress of the situation, you know, and they kind of blame themselves for not noticing this or not noticing that. So
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
I don't know. There's a lot there. I mean, it's a lot that goes on, but I don't remember having any other experience other than focusing on what I was hearing at the time when I had my experience.
Yeah. Just thought I'd kind of touch base on that just to see if there is any, correlation to anybody else's experience, because a lot of people say they experience similar things when they do have those encounters. I wanted to touch base on the whole physical and supernatural aspect of these cryptids, right? I come from a biblical background. Like I mentioned, my mom, when I was a kid, I used to go to church and stuff. And growing up, I didn't understand certain things that I read in Genesis about fallen angels coming down and, mating with the women of the earth and stuff like that, which in essence, they were spiritual and women were physical creatures. So what's your take on that? And how factual do you think that is to the reality of the world that we live in? You know?
I've talked to so many people who believe that in some way Bigfoot, Sasquatch are Nephilim, however you say. And it's been difficult for me over the years to relate to that. I just don't see it. That's just my personal opinion. It's totally subjective. I don't have any reason to say that that's not the case. It's just a feeling, I guess, that I have based on the experiences that I have talked to people. I'm almost 500 episodes into Sasquatch Odyssey at this point.
Congratulations.
And I've talked to so many people outside of that don't even make it on the show.
Yeah.
I see people when I go to book signings or I go to speak at conferences and people tell me their stories. And I just don't see that being a possibility. It sounds like a great story. It is a cool story, but it doesn't make sense and correlate with some of the stories that I've heard, the majority of the stories I've heard, to be honest with you.
Sure.
Most of the times, these things are doing very animalistic things. They're in the woods, they're hunting deer, they're building structures, they're doing whatever animals would do. So it's more of ape-like behavior than anything. So again, I mean, who's to say? I'd love to be wrong. I don't mind being wrong if anybody can prove me wrong, but it's just my opinion. I just don't see it. I had a guy literally a couple of weeks ago on the show that has caused a little bit of a stir. He had that opinion of these things being Nephilim, and some of the some of the audio that he has recorded in the past, he has felt like he's heard certain words or certain phrases that these things are saying. And I think it's really kind of auditory pareidolia. I think he's confirming what he believes because he comes from a very biblical standpoint on most things in his life. And we tend to do that. It's confirmation bias. We take what we already believe and we try to fit everything sort of in that square or that circle to fit what we believe. And he brought up Genesis. He talked about the Nephilim during our conversation. it's a hard road for me to hoe. I just can't get there.
Yeah.
I believe that there may be something more to these things, but I think they're just a flesh and blood creature. If they exist at all, I think there's some sort of a relic hominoid of some sort that people are having experiences with, man.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's great. I also feel like we're in this to kind of seek the truth, right? Seek the knowledge of everything that is around us in our reality, our realm, in our world and stuff like that. So I feel like we're never really, as researchers like yourself, you're very experienced, very seasoned in your research. So you just try to tend to look for the truth. But for us, I feel like we're very open, right? Like you said, there could be a possibility. Nobody really knows the truth, right? So I'm the first one to admit, hey, I was wrong. If there's some type of concrete evidence that somebody brings to the table and they can prove their point, hey, maybe that's some other way to look at it, you know? So I believe that's great that you have such an open mind about things like that, because like you say, we never really know. It could be, it could not be, you know. Very interesting stuff there though, you know. So I want to go back. I keep talking about your book because from what I've read, it was very interesting stuff, you know. Can you talk to us about chapter 3, Sasquatch history, the Bauman incident? Am I saying that correctly?
The Bauman incident?
Bauman incident, yeah. Can you talk to us about that in detail a little bit?
It's a very interesting story. And some people say it's nothing more than a story, but it comes from Teddy Roosevelt's book. And it is something that was supposedly relayed directly to him that he felt strong enough to write in his book. And it's basically, in a nutshell, this guy's out on the frontier and he gets killed by what most people believe is a Sasquatch. And I felt it compelling that it's one of the most famous things that you'll find in Bigfoot lore. I mean, it's one of the things that people point to often that are trying to confirm the existence of these creatures. What's better than saying a U.S. president wrote about this guy who got killed by Sasquatch, right? They have to exist. If that's your narrative, then that's one of the best stories to do that. But I felt compelled to put it in the book because it is one of those stories that most people have heard about. And if you haven't, I think it's an interesting story to start with. I'm not so sure, honestly, about it because he didn't experience it firsthand. It wasn't something that he saw firsthand. It is just an anecdotal story. And unfortunately, that's what we're left with in most of these cases. I put the Albert Osman story in the book. It's one of the most compelling stories. The Ape Canyon story is top tier when it comes to Sasquatch lore, right? These guys that were attacked in this cabin. And Mark Marcel, who was generous enough to give me a couple of great photos. He's forgotten more about the Ape Canyon incident from 1924 than most of us will ever know. And he provided me with a couple of those photographs in the book. So shout out to you, Mark. I appreciate that. But I felt it compelling to put those in there because sometimes that's all we really have when it comes to belief in Bigfoot, right? You just have to take these stories like the Bauman incident, or you take the Ape Canyon story, or you take Albert Osman, who was supposedly kidnapped by a Sasquatch and spent like 7 days with these things in the woods, right? Until he made his escape with the snuff can. You know, it's one of those things that I find those stories very compelling. Some of them are hard to believe, honestly. You know, the Bauman incident, it could have been anything. I mean, they were out in the middle of nowhere. They were in the wild. It could have been any creature. It could have been another person that took this guy out, right? But it's interesting that Roosevelt thought enough of the story to include it in his book because I think he felt, at least I'm subjectively, I mean, that's just my opinion. Obviously, I don't know. I felt like he thought there was more to the story. That's why he felt compelled enough to put it in his book. And obviously, you know, a lot of years later here in 2024, I'm still talking about it in my book. So it's one of those things that when you deal in anecdotal stories like I do, I mean, Sasquatch Odyssey is literally it's just a story-based podcast. People who have experiences come on and share their experiences, and you take what you want, you leave the rest, you believe it or not. It is what it is. They're their experiences. So but that's one of the things I wanted to talk about in the book to sort of lay the foundation for, look, these things have been happening for a long time. These stories are out there from years and years and years ago, whether it was Roosevelt's time, whether it was 1924 with Ape Canyon, whether it was 24 with the Osman story happened almost simultaneously in the same time that the Ape Canyon story happened. And these things have continued throughout the 50s is when you started having Jerry Crew and Bigfoot was coined. And then you have 67, you have the Patterson-Gimlin film.
Yeah, Patterson.
And it's continued to happen throughout history. To this very day, people continue to have experiences that they can't explain. So again, you know, when you get to the end of the book, a little bit of a spoiler for you. I know you're not there yet, but people have asked me, people have poked fun, you know, a couple of people, I'm in a couple of Facebook groups. There's a Coalition for Critical Thinking and Sasquatch Research Group. And these guys are complete skeptics and most of them are cynics when it comes to Bigfoot. You know, they're like, oh, when was Sasquatch unleashed? And how did you find out the truth? Well, honestly, here's the bottom line for Bigfoot. And most of all this stuff, when it boils down to it, the truth is really what you choose to believe. right? Your truth is different from my truth. Somebody else might have a different truth. It's all up to you. I mean, you listen to the stories, you do your own research, you have your own experiences, and what you choose to believe is the truth for you may be different from me, but the truth is the truth, whether it's yours or mine.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you walk us through, you mentioned earlier, I actually wrote this down because I wanted to get back to this. Can you walk us through in detail about your UFO experience?
Oh, you're taking notes, man. You're taking notes. I love it.
You got to do it.
So yeah, the first experience was when I was 16 with my mom. And we were living in we weren't in the same house, obviously. We moved out of the haunted house and where I had the Bigfoot experience. She had divorced my dad. We were living there with my sister and me and her. It was during the summertime. She had went out to the store and again, we're in a very small town. I can't even believe there's a store open. It must have been a convenience store that she went to for whatever reason. But she comes back and I'm on the phone with a friend from school. And my mom walks in the door and she's like, "Get off the phone. You got to come outside." I'm like, she didn't act like that. I'm like, I'm on the phone. Like, she's like, "Hang up the phone and come outside now." Okay. Hung the phone up. I walk in the backyard and she just walks out and she points straight up and she's just like looking. It's almost like a scene out of a movie, you know. She's like dead eyes, like. So I look up and I'm like, oh my God. There's like this, I don't know, probably 700 to 800 foot craft.
Wow.
Floating in the air, maybe 1,500 feet above us. And it's just floating. It's not moving very fast. There's no noise. There's no lights. It's completely like this. It wasn't bright metallic. It was like a matte / bright metallic. No seams, no rivets, no nothing. Just one solid piece of metal floating. And the moonlight is the only light that's reflecting off of it. There's no other lights. It just goes down behind this ridge, behind our house, and disappears. It's gone. Wow. And we're just standing there in awe, like, oh my God, what did we just see? I mean, I don't even know how to describe the feeling that we had at the moment. All right. I knew it wasn't a plane. It wasn't a helicopter. It wasn't a balloon. It wasn't a blimp. I mean, there's nothing that it could have been other than what we saw was this huge metallic craft 1,500 feet above us in the air, floating down and disappearing. So my mom's one of those people that she has to have answers. She's kind of like me. She's like, oh no, but I'm calling the police. She called radio stations. She called everybody she could possibly call. And I don't think anybody ever saw it. I think she finally found a radio station nearby that said somebody had called about it, but otherwise it just wasn't a thing. I mean, nobody really reported it, right? And I'm thinking, how could nobody else experience this? We clearly saw it. Like, she's not crazy. I'm not crazy. We saw the same thing. She saw this thing driving home. She was speeding getting home because she was afraid it was going to disappear before she could get somebody else to say, there's this thing, right? Oh. So I don't know, man. It was weird. It was probably one of the weirdest experiences that I've ever had because there was no doubt. It was so close. 1,500 feet is not that far up in the sky. It seems like a lot, but when you're thinking about it, we see planes fly over us at 32,000 feet, and you can pretty much make out exactly what it is, right? You know, it's a plane. But this thing had no noise, no lights, no nothing, and it just disappeared behind the ridge behind our house. Wow. And I've had other UFO experiences since then, but it's been farther off. It's been lights in the sky. I mean, the most recent was last October. I went up to Radium Hot Springs in BC, Canada, and I was up there for 7 days on a Bigfoot expedition with Todd Standing at his research area up there. And the second night we were there researching Bigfoot, we weren't really having a whole lot of activity. We had some whoops. We ended up having rocks thrown at us and some other things that night, but we saw UFOs that night. I looked up in the sky. The sky was beautiful. It's wide open. We're 18 miles deep in the woods. There's no light pollution, right? So it's the most beautiful sky I've ever seen. And I'm looking up and I see this dot of light. and it looks like you could see the planes at like 32,000 feet flying in formation. There wasn't a ton of planes, but there were some going from like Calgary to Alberta. We'd see a plane maybe every couple of hours or whatever. And they were at about 30,000 feet. These things were probably estimate, and it's a total estimation, 70, 80,000 feet in elevation. And I'm watching they're just little balls of light. There was one, then there was two. I mean, at one point, I think we were watching 12 at one time. Wow. There was 3 of us watching these lights. And we went in and got binoculars. That's all we had. We didn't have anything other than binoculars. But it was a little bit different than just the naked eye. We could see a little bit better. Yeah. They were white and blue balls of light. And I was watching one at one point, and I'm estimating there were probably, I don't know, I say 1,800 to 2,000 miles an hour this thing was moving. Oh, wow. It's going straight up in the sky. In relation to me, it's going straight up. It stops and makes a left-hand turn 90 degrees and shoots off at probably 1,800 to 2,000 miles an hour. It was the craziest thing I'd ever seen. And we watched these things for hours. And I think one of the craziest things that was going on around us is, if that weren't enough, we had a shooting star. Came over me. I saw a shooting star. Then another one. Then another shooting star. And at one point, we're standing there. We're all 3 focused on this area of the sky. And I see out of my peripheral, I guess it was a meteorite. I don't know if it's a meteorite. I don't know what the right terminology is. This thing comes from like left to right, and it goes over both. And we all stop looking at what we're looking at, and we focus on it. It just explodes into this color. It's just, I've never seen anything like this, dude. That's people amazing, are probably like, this. What is this dude smoking? I mean, he has got to be on something, but I swear it's the truth. And we're there for Bigfoot, right? We don't care about aliens or UFOs, but it was some of the wildest stuff we'd seen that night. I mean, Kyle and Richard, who were with me there around the campfire, they were like, this is the wildest thing I've ever seen. And I'm like, I don't know, man. Amazing. Maybe it followed me, man. These things tend to follow me. I've seen this stuff before, but that was a wild night. I've never seen anything like that in the sky. And people are like, oh yeah, of course it was, you were watching meteors. And I know what a meteor, I know what a meteorite is. Oh, well, those things that you were watching were probably just satellites. I don't know any satellites that stop in the middle of their trajectory and make an immediate left-hand turn and go 90 degrees in the opposite direction. That did it for me, man. If there was ever any doubt about what I was seeing at that point, that's impossible. I mean, it couldn't have been a plane. Anybody who was flying that plane would have been crushed like a bug on a windshield. They would have been done. Yeah. So I don't know, man. I don't know what it was, but it was definitely interesting.
Yeah, definitely interesting indeed. Wow. Man, that's amazing. It seems like these experiences tend to follow you throughout your life, you know? Seems like you're I don't want to scare you, but it seems like you're either cursed or blessed, man, you know? Because you could actually talk about these experiences, but following you is kind of a scary thing to think about, you know? It's so funny you said that, Abner, because I'm telling you, when I started my show, Sasquatch Odyssey, I used to say I was very skeptical. I'm still skeptical when it comes to everything, honestly, even my own experiences. And I would say to people, you know, it's really odd to have people, you know, you have people come on and say, oh yeah, I've seen Bigfoot 5 times. Oh, okay. Yeah, really? All right. You've seen them 5 times. Oh yeah, have you ever had UFO experiences? Oh yeah, I've seen UFOs. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about ghosts? Oh yeah, I've lived in a haunted house. And I'm thinking, wow, there's no way that all this stuff's happening to this one person. And I used to go, I'd kind of write them off. And I was talking to somebody, I was actually on another podcast at some point, and the host keeps looking at me as I tell my experiences. He's like, you know what's funny, Brian? You're that person. You've now had all these experiences. And I'm thinking, oh my God, yeah, I just became that person. So I've never done that since. I've always said, you know, if somebody has multiple experiences, I might lift my eyebrow and I might shake my head a little bit, but I'm like, I can't doubt it because I've had experiences that I can't explain. And I guess it's not uncommon for people to do that, but it's interesting you say that it follows you, because I think, again, it goes back to what Preston said. It's so weird. And I think it's more, again, I'm an Occam's razor. I'm a skeptical kind of guy. And I say it's more of a mundane explanation that, you know, I have experiences with UFOs and I've seen these things that I've seen because I look up in the sky. Most people don't do that,
right? I mean, how many people, I do it when I'm in a car. If I'm driving and somebody else is driving, I'm watching out the sky. I'm watching the sky and seeing what's happening. I pay attention to my surroundings. Some of the weird things that I found here on our property and possibly related to Bigfoot and other places, it's because I'm looking for it. I don't necessarily look for ghosts, but I'm open to that. I listen to experiences and I try to have experiences, whatever they are, and let them play out. And I'm in tune with it. So I think it's probably less of a woo thing of, oh yeah, Bigfoot's following you, or UFOs are following you, or ghosts are following you. I think it's more of just being open to the experience. Once you open yourself up to the possibility of these things being real, the more apt you are to having some sort of an experience with them. Because if you say everything's fake and nothing's happening, what kind of experiences are you really going to have? I mean, unless something slaps you in the face or Bigfoot drags you off into the woods, are you really going to have an experience? No, you're not going to be open to it, right? So that's how I look at it.
No, that's definitely interesting. I think we think the same when it comes to that. You have to be open to these experiences and open to people's experiences, because we're all dealing with things, you know, whether it's physical or spiritual, you know. It's just, like you said before, it's up to you to believe it, you know. What's the truth for you, you know? I mean, no one's really going to know the truth, you know, but what's the truth for you? I wanted to follow up with a question with that. Man, you said about 12, right? Do you feel like these things are out here observing us, or do you feel like they are just like, what's their memo or what's their agenda, right? Do you feel like they're here to harm us, or to kind of just, you know, do no harm to us and just let us know that they're here? Like, what's your opinion on that, man?
Well, I guess it would depend. Are you talking like aliens? Are you talking about ghosts? Are you talking, what were you talking about?
Oh, well, we could talk about the aliens, you know, and the cryptids. Like, do you think they're here to observe us, to kind of let us know that they're here, or just to kind of harm us? Because people have had those experiences where they feel like those things are there to harm them, you know, or like alien abductions and stuff like that. And like, you know, what's your take on that?
That's one of those questions I've pondered specifically with aliens, because there are a lot of negative experiences people have. Yeah. And again, you know, I've talked to people. Preston, I had a lady on the show and her name escapes me. I apologize. She came on the show the last time I had Preston on, and she had experiences. Dolly, I believe was her name, Dolly. She'd written a book recently. And she had a lot of wild experiences that she claimed that she was abducted early as a child. Her earliest memory was being a baby, being abducted by aliens. And she's come to a point full circle where they have taught her, and she flies alien ships to other galaxies. Wow. Right? So she's had what she believes to be positive experiences with what people would describe as alien or ETs or extraterrestrials. But I said to her, and Preston and I kind of got into a little tiff about it, because they don't like to use the word, and I say they, Preston and Dolly and some other people that I've had experiences talking with that have been abductees. They have been abducted from their homes or their cars. You're being taken against your will. And my argument was this: I don't care who it is or what it is, whether it's a person or an ET or a Bigfoot or Nessie or a unicorn. I don't care what it is you're talking about. If something is taking you from your home or your workplace or your car against your will, without your consent, that is a violent interaction. That's just my opinion, right? That's abduction. You're going against your will. And they like to use the word now contactee, right? That's, you know, Preston was like, no, these are contactees. Abductee tends to have this negative connotation. And I'm like, well, it should, because you're being taken by aliens out of your house and you don't want to go. But to say all that, I say all that to say, yeah, I believe there could be some nefarious things going on, because I've had contact with people and talked to people in the past who have worked particular cases that have worked with people that disappeared. There was one particular incident that I can remember. I had an investigator that I was in contact with who had worked with a mother and a daughter who were very afraid for their life because they were having constant activity with what they believed to be extraterrestrials. And he lost contact with them, and they have never been found since. And they were calling him, telling him that these things were coming and taking them from their house.
Wow.
So if you go on that, I would say, yeah, there's a big possibility that there's probably some nefarious things going on. And here's the other thing that's interesting to me. I've had conversations with people who claim that aliens and humans have had interactions for decades. I mean, there's rumors and conspiracy theories about U.S. presidents in the past meeting with and making treaties with extraterrestrials for whatever reason. And I've always said this, if you can come and take me through a wall, do you really need a treaty with anybody to just say, we won't do that. We'll only take cows, right? I don't think so. So that kind of stuff has always sort of been, I don't really necessarily buy into that. I think these things can do whatever they want, whenever they want. And I think the bottom line is we're lucky that they haven't done more than they already have. That's my opinion. And I still think that it's possible that they may take people and possibly animals and other things for different reasons and maybe bring people back. And I know people who have claimed, I've interviewed people who have implants in their body today that believe they're extraterrestrial in nature. Why they do it, I can't tell you. Why they've done it for so many decades and continue to do it, I don't know. But I think it certainly happens. And if you're taking people out of their homes against their will, without their knowledge, and putting things in their body without their knowledge and or against their will, I think that's pretty nefarious. So, and as far as cryptids are concerned, there's plenty of people who have theories. You know, David Paulides has written an entire series of, I think, 7 books at this point about the missing 411. And although he never says it out loud, he certainly implies that Bigfoot is possibly at fault for some of these disappearances. And so if these things exist, they certainly have the propensity for violence because we're humans and any great ape has the propensity for violence. So I think anything can happen, but I don't think every one of them is nefarious and a bloodthirsty killer. So, you know, again, I've documented stories where people have found bodies that they believe were killed by dogmen. So, you know, I think it's a possibility, certainly, but it's always a possibility if you're just talking about human beings. Human beings by nature can do some very bad things to each other. So I think when you're talking about aliens and cryptids, that is a possibility. I don't think it's necessarily the norm. I think it might be the exception, not the rule, luckily for us. Yeah. Because if they wanted to take us, they certainly could.
Yeah, for sure. So I want to ask you, what made you, in your words, what made you write this book? What do you want people to take from this book? What made you do it?
It's something that I wanted to add to the conversation. I wanted to add my voice, I guess, to the overall narrative of these things, because I think there's so many books out there that just go over and rehash old theories and old thoughts on the subject. So I wanted to try to do something that was a little bit more fresh and new. And honestly, the main reason that I did it was to be a voice for scientific reasoning. I wanted to get into some of the science. I wanted to talk about some of the things that we can do as investigators to be citizen scientists. And you haven't gotten there yet. You're only on chapter 5. So you'll eventually get there in the later chapters. And I go into the scientific method. I talk about evidence. I break down the evidence that's out there. I talk about what is evidence, what isn't, some of the best ways to get some of that stuff. I talk about fossilization, why we may not have found a body. I go into the fossilization process. So I wanted to be more of a scientific voice when it comes to Bigfoot research and not just rehash old narratives. And I could have done 15 books on nothing but just encounter stories that people love to read. Those are sensational, right? Ooh, he was in the cabin. The thing was outside the window. That's great. But it really doesn't move the ball down the field, right? I wanted to push the ball a little bit farther down the field, hopefully with the research, and give people that may be looking to get in the subject, maybe into the subject, and really don't know how to help push that ball down the field, to give them at least my perspective on how they can do that and give them a little bit of a baseline to start from.
Well, very well put. So before we wrap this episode up, Brian, can you tell the audience one more time where they can find you and your work, please?
Yes, the best way is to, you could search it on wherever you're listening to us right now on any of your podcast apps. Sasquatch Odyssey podcast. I do the True Crime Odyssey podcast. I do That Bigfoot podcast, and I do the Backwoods Horror Stories podcast. You can find those anywhere you listen to podcasts. But the best place is just go to paranormalworldproductions.com and you can find us there. You can find an About Me section. You can see all about me. You can leave me a voicemail. You can send me an email. You can buy one of the books there. I autograph the books if you buy it off the website, and we send those out a couple of times a week. And then you can see all the other shows, and we have blogs there. So every episode we do blog posts, and you can see some cool videos and photos and anything related to the show there.
That's great. A lot of great stuff there, guys. So definitely check that out. So Brian, thanks for being on Apocalyptic Anomalies. And remember, guys, to always innovate honesty and always illuminate the truth. Bye. Thank you for watching, everyone. I hope you guys enjoyed that show. And remember to share the show, because that's the only way that this podcast will grow. Until next time, everyone, stay safe, stay blessed, and remember to innovate honesty and always illuminate the truth. Bye.